The stars had never been kind to humanity, but humanity had learned to survive them anyway. In the year 2487, the Terran corridor stretched across 47 colonized systems, a modest territory compared to the great empires that ruled the galaxy. But it was theirs, and they had earned every inch of it with blood and sweat and stubborn refusal to die. Humanity was not the strongest species in the galaxy, not the oldest, not the most advanced, but there was something about them that made other species uneasy. Something they could never quite name. A fire behind the eyes, a tension in the way they carried themselves, like a creature that had been cornered too many times and had decided long ago that it would never be cornered again. But this story does not begin in the present. It begins 60 years earlier, in the cold and silent void between stars, where a ship called the ESS Dawn Cradle drifted without power, without hope, and without any answer to its desperate cries for help. The Dawn Cradle had been humanity's pride, a massive colony vessel, carrying 400,000 souls toward a new world, families, and children, and engineers, and doctors, all of them dreaming of a fresh start on a planet they had named New Horizon. But the dream had shattered when the ship's main reactor suffered a cascade failure that ripped through 3 of its 4 engine cores. The ship was dead in space. Captain Amara Osei had done everything she could. She had ordered emergency protocols, sealed the damaged sections, rationed the remaining power to keep life support running. But the math was cruel, and she knew it. They had enough air for 12 days, enough food for 9, and the nearest human outpost was 31 days away at sublight speed. She sent the distress signal on every frequency, every channel, every band of communication that existed, and she sent it in every language humanity had ever encountered since first contact with alien civilizations 20 years prior. The great powers of the galaxy heard the signal. The Rithani hegemony heard it and calculated that a rescue operation would cost more than the humans were worth, so they filed the signal under noted and moved on. The collective of Orth heard it and debated for 6 days about whether intervening would set a problematic precedent. And by the time they reached a committee decision to further evaluate the situation, it would have been too late anyway. The Galactic Council heard it and issued a statement expressing profound sympathy for the plight of the Terran vessel, and did absolutely nothing else. 400,000 people were going to die in the dark, and the galaxy had decided that this was acceptable. But then something happened that nobody expected, least of all the humans. A signal came back. It was weak and scratchy, and came from a species so minor that most galactic databases barely took note. Had an entry for them, the Velari, a race of insectoid empaths who lived on a small resource-poor world called Thyra, in a forgotten corner of the galaxy. They were not warriors, not conquerors, not empire builders. They were healers and farmers and poets. And their technology was at least 2 generations behind everyone else. But they came. Matriarch Seluna, the leader of the Velari, did not convene a committee. She did not run a cost analysis. She did not consult with galactic lawyers about liability. She simply heard the cries of 400,000 beings who were about to die, and she made a decision. She sent everything. Every merchant ship the Velari owned was loaded with food and medical supplies and launched toward the Dawn Cradle's coordinates. These were not fast ships. They were old and patched together and held in one piece by hope more than engineering. But Seluna pushed them as hard as they could go. One day before the food would have run out completely. Captain Osei stood on the bridge of the Dawn Cradle and watched through the viewport as a ragged collection of mismatched alien vessels surrounded her dying ship like a swarm of protective insects. And for the first time in 8 days, she allowed herself to cry. The rescue was not easy. The Velari ships were too small to take on large numbers of passengers at once. So they made dozens of trips, ferrying humans in groups to Thyra, where temporary shelters had been erected. Valari healers worked around the clock, treating the sick and the injured. Some of them pushing their empathic abilities so far that they collapsed from exhaustion. 11 Valari healers died during the rescue, their bodies simply giving out because they refused to stop working while humans still needed help. 389,000 humans survived. When it was over, when the last human had been transferred to safety, and the crisis had passed, Captain Osei met with Matriarch Seluna face-to-face for the first time. The Violari leader was small and fragile-looking, with iridescent wings that caught the light, and large compound eyes that seemed to hold an ocean of warmth. Osei asked her why. Why had the Violari come when no one else would? Why had they given everything they had for a species they had never even met? Seluna tilted her head in the way that Violari did when they found a question strange, and she answered in her soft, clicking voice. No thinking creature should die alone in the dark. That was all she said, and it was enough. Humanity rebuilt. They recovered the Dawn Cradle. They repaired it. They eventually reached New Horizon and established the colony they had dreamed of, and life went on as it always does. But they did not forget. The names of the 11 Violari healers who died saving human lives were carved into a monument on New Horizon. Taller than any building on the planet, every human child in every school, in every colony, learned the story of the Dawn Cradle and the Violari who came when no one else would. It was not taught as history. It was taught as a sacred debt. And deep within the core of Terran law, encoded into the very foundation of their civilization, a protocol was written. The Terran Remembrance Protocol. And it contained a single unbreakable oath. Those who helped us in our darkest hour shall never face theirs alone. For 60 years, the protocol sat quietly in the archives, waiting. Then, on a routine Tuesday evening in the Terran diplomatic offices on Mars, a young officer named Commander Jonah Mercer picked up a signal that made his blood run cold. It was fragmented and weak and full of static, but the source was unmistakable. Thyra. The Violari were screaming for help, and then the signal went dead. Mercer sat in the silence for a long moment, staring at his console, and then he reached for his communicator and called Admiral Kailani Voss, because he knew, as every human knew, that when the Violari called, humanity would answer. It was never even a question. Admiral Kailani Voss was not a woman who showed her emotions easily. She had commanded warships for 23 years, had faced down pirates and border skirmishes, and one particularly nasty standoff with a Rathani patrol fleet that could have become a war if she had blinked. But she had not blinked, because Kailani Voss did not blink. When Commander Mercer played the distress signal from Thyra, in her office, aboard the Terran battleship Resolve, she listened to the entire recording without moving, her dark eyes fixed on the speaker, as the broken voice of a Violari operator begged for anyone to hear them. The voice was shaking with terror, and behind it there were sounds that needed no translation, explosions and screaming and the unmistakable crack of weapons fire. When the signal cut to static, Voss sat in silence for 10 seconds. Mercer watched her face and saw something shift behind her eyes, something old and deep and dangerous. Everyone in the fleet knew about the Admiral, that her grandmother, a woman named Leilani Voss, had been a 6-year-old child aboard the Dawn Cradle, that she had been carried off the dying ship in the arms of a Violari healer, who had sung to her softly in the clicking Violari tongue to keep her calm. That healer's name was Thili, and Thili was one of the 11 who had died. Admiral Voss had a small pendant around her neck that she never took off, a piece of Violari crystal that her grandmother had kept until the day she died, and then passed to her daughter, who passed it to Kailani, and Kailani touched it now, just briefly before she spoke. "Get me intelligence on Thyra," she said. "Everything we have, everything we can get, I want it on my desk in 2 hours." The intelligence came fast, and it painted a picture that made every officer in the briefing room go quiet with fury. The Dominion of Akar had invaded Thyra. The Akari were a reptilian species known for their military brutality and their endless hunger for expansion. Their empire had swallowed 14 systems in the last century alone, always targeting the weak, always choosing victims who could not fight back. They were predators in the truest sense, and they had chosen Thyra because the Vilari had something they wanted. Deep beneath the surface of Thyra lay massive deposits of a rare mineral called resonance quartz, a crystalline substance that could amplify faster-than-light communication arrays by a factor of 1,000. Whoever controlled the quartz controlled galactic communications, and the Akari intended to control it all. The invasion had been swift and merciless. The Vilari had no military, no weapons, no defensive fleet. They had never needed any because they had never threatened anyone. And it had taken the Akari less than 3 days to conquer the entire planet. But conquering Thyra was not enough for the Akari commander. A decorated warlord named Tyrant General Kazrek had decided to make an example of the Vilari. He wanted the galaxy to see what happened to worlds that sat on resources the Dominion wanted. So he had rounded up the Vilari population and forced them into labor camps, making them mine their own world's quartz with their bare hands. The camps were brutal. Vilari workers were given barely enough food to survive. Those who collapsed from exhaustion were dragged aside and left to die. The Vilari were empaths, which meant they did not just feel their own suffering, they felt the suffering of every being around them. The camps were a special kind of hell for creatures built to feel the pain of others. And then Kazrek had done something that crossed a line even by the cold standards of galactic politics. He had captured Matriarch Seluna, the ancient leader of the Vilari, now old and frail and nearly blind, had been dragged from her home and paraded through the streets of the Vilari capital in chains, while Akari soldiers jeered and spat at her. Kazrek had broadcast the entire spectacle across the galactic net, his scaled face grinning as he forced Seluna to kneel before him in front of cameras that carried the image to every corner of civilized space. "Let this be a lesson," Kazrek had announced to the galaxy. "The weak exist to serve the strong, and any species that forgets this truth will be reminded." The broadcast had been watched by billions. The Galactic Council had responded with a strongly worded resolution, expressing concern and calling for dialogue. The Rithani hegemony had quietly signed a trade agreement with the Akari for access to the quartz. The Collective of Orth had issued a statement about the importance of non-interference in sovereign territorial disputes. Nobody was coming to help the Vilari. The galaxy had once again decided that the suffering of the weak was an acceptable price for its own comfort, just as it had 60 years ago when humanity was dying on the Dawn Cradle. But this time, the people who owed the Vilari their very existence were watching. Admiral Voss watched the broadcast of Seluna being forced to her knees, and every officer in the room watched the Admiral's face, and what they saw there made several of them take an involuntary step back. Voss was not angry the way most people got angry. She did not shout or slam her fist on the table or curse. Instead, she went very still, the kind of stillness that comes before an earthquake. And when she finally spoke, her voice was calm and level and absolutely terrifying in its certainty. "Activate the Terran Remembrance Protocol." The room went silent. Everyone there knew what those words meant. They had studied it in the academy. They had sworn oaths around it. But none of them had ever expected to hear those words spoken aloud in their lifetime. Because the Remembrance Protocol was not just a military order. It was the most sacred obligation in Terran civilization. It was the promise that had been written in the aftermath of the Dawn Cradle, when humanity had looked out at a galaxy that had left them to die and said, "Never again." Never again would they stand by while those who had shown them kindness suffered. Commander Mercer felt something tighten in his chest. Not fear exactly, but something closer to awe. Because he understood now that what was about to happen was not just a military operation, it was a reckoning. And humanity had been preparing for it for 60 years. Across the Terran corridor, encrypted messages began flowing through military channels. Colonial governors received priority alerts. Fleet commanders opened sealed orders that had been waiting in vaults since before most of them were born. And on every human world, from Earth to New Horizon to the farthest mining outpost on the edge of known space, phrase appeared on every public display. The Violari called, "We answer." Within hours, the largest military mobilization in human history had begun, and the galaxy, which had grown so comfortable ignoring the cries of the helpless, was about to learn a lesson it would never forget. Humanity remembered its debts, every single one of them. And payment was coming. The Rithani hegemony had assembled war fleets that stretched across entire star systems. The Collective of Orth had once deployed 100,000 automated warships in a single campaign. Even the Ikari Dominion had launched invasions that darkened the skies of entire worlds. But none of them had ever seen anything like what humanity did in the 3 weeks following the activation of the Terran Remembrance Protocol. It was not just a military operation, it was a civilization moving as one. On Earth, the oldest shipyards that had been running at half capacity for decades roared back to life overnight. Civilian engineers, who had spent their careers building cargo vessels and mining platforms, walked into military retrofit centers and volunteered without being asked. They did not need to be asked, because they had grown up hearing the story of the Dawn Cradle. They had learned it before they learned algebra, and they understood in their bones that this was the moment the story had been preparing them for. On New Horizon, the colony that existed only because the Volari had saved the Dawn Cradle, the response was overwhelming. The planetary governor declared a state of total contribution, meaning every resource the colony could spare was redirected to the war effort. Farmers loaded food supplies onto transport ships. Factory workers produced ammunition and medical kits in double shifts. And at the base of the great monument that bore the names of the 11 Volari healers, thousands of colonists gathered in silent vigil, leaving flowers and candles and handwritten notes that said things like, "We have not forgotten, and we are coming." From the outer mining colonies came volunteer crews who knew how to handle asteroid tugs and heavy machinery in zero gravity. These were rough people, hard people, people who wrestled a living from dead rocks in the void. And they brought their ships and their tools and their absolutely ferocious willingness to fight for what was right. In total, 3 full Terran battle groups converged on the rally point near the Thyra system. Over 900 warships, plus support vessels, medical frigates, troop transports, and a civilian volunteer fleet that nobody had asked for, but nobody turned away. And the galaxy watched all of this with a mixture of confusion and growing unease. Ambassador Drethkal of the Rithani hegemony was the first to attempt diplomatic intervention. He appeared on Admiral Voss's communication screen, looking appropriately concerned, his 4 eyes blinking in the pattern that Rithani used to express serious displeasure. "Admiral Voss," he said, "the hegemony urges the Terran government to reconsider this provocative action. The Ikari Dominion is a recognized sovereign power, and their operations on Thyra are an internal matter. Confrontation will only lead to unnecessary bloodshed." Voss looked at him for a long. "Ambassador," she replied, "the hegemony received the Dawn Cradle's distress signal 60 years ago, and you calculated that 400,000 human lives were not worth the cost of a rescue mission. You do not get to lecture me about unnecessary bloodshed." She cut the transmission. The Collective of Orth tried next, sending a formal diplomatic protest. arguing that humanity's mobilization violated 17 different articles of the Galactic Cooperation Accord. Their message was long and full of legal terminology and citations from treaties that most species had forgotten existed. Humanity's legal team sent back a single-page response that cited Article 9 of the same accord, which guaranteed the right of any species to defend a recognized ally from unprovoked aggression. At the bottom of the page, someone had handwritten, "The Volari are our allies, deal with it." But the real moment, the one that would be replayed and studied and quoted, was about to happen. Centuries to come, happened in the Grand Chamber of the Galactic Council. Ambassador Elena Vasquez was 61 years old, a former schoolteacher from a small town in Chile, who had entered politics because she believed that words could change things. She was not physically imposing. She did not have the towering presence of the Rhythani delegates, or the cold authority of the Orth representatives. She was a small woman, with gray streaks in her dark hair, and reading glasses she sometimes forgot to take off. But when she stood at the podium of the Grand Chamber, something in the room changed. She began quietly. 60 years ago, a ship full of our people was dying, she said. 400,000 men and women and children, drifting in the dark, running out of air, and they called for help. They called every species in this galaxy. They called this council. She paused and looked around the chamber, and this council expressed its profound. The words landed like stones. The Rhythani hegemony calculated the cost, and decided our people were not worth it. The collective of Orth formed a committee that is, I believe, still technically in session. A few nervous sounds rippled through the chamber. But the Volari came, Vasquez continued, and now her voice had an edge to it. Not anger exactly, but something harder. Something that had been forged over 60 years of remembering. They had almost nothing. Their ships were old. Their world was poor. They had no reason to help us, except that they heard people crying in the dark, and they could not bear to do nothing. She pressed a control on the podium, and a list appeared on every screen in the chamber. 11 names, written in both Volari script and Terran standard. These are the names of the Volari healers who died saving our people. They worked until their bodies broke, because they refused to stop while human children still needed help. Philly, who carried a 6-year-old girl to safety while her own hearts were failing. Morvine, who performed 17 straight hours of surgery on human patients she had never trained to treat. Alice, who gave her own food rations to a human infant and starved herself to death over 3 days. The chamber was completely silent. "We carved these names into stone," Vasquez said. "We taught them to our children. We made them part of who we are, because humanity does not forget kindness. We are not capable of it." She straightened, and her voice rose. "Now the Volari are dying. They are being enslaved and brutalized by the Akari Dominion. And this council has responded with another expression of deep concern. And the hegemony has signed a trade deal with the invaders. And the collective has debated the legal nuances of non-interference." She took off her reading glasses and set them on the podium. "So let me be very clear about what is going to happen next. The Terran fleet is going to Phyra. We are going to remove the Akari from that world, and we are going to bring the Volari home safe. And if any power in this galaxy attempts to stop us or to interfere with this mission, they should understand something about humanity." She looked directly into the broadcast cameras. "We remember who helped us, and we remember who did not. We keep a ledger, and every species in this chamber is on it somewhere. I suggest you think very carefully about which side of that ledger you want to be on." She picked up her glasses, put them back on, and walked out of the chamber without another word. The broadcast of Vasquez's speech reached every inhabited world in the galaxy within hours. It was translated into 400 languages. It was played and replayed on news networks, and discussed in forums, and debated in universities. And the phrase that stuck, the one that embedded itself in the galactic vocabulary like a splinter, that could not be removed, was the ledger. The Galactic Council voted on a resolution to block humanity's fleet. It failed. Not because the votes were not there, but because when the moment came to press the button, too many ambassadors looked at the list of 11 names still displayed on their screens, and could not bring themselves to side against the people who had come to honor those names. The path to Phyra was open, and 900 human warships began to move. Tyrant General Kazrek stood on the command bridge of his flagship, the Dominion's Wrath, and watched the Terran fleet emerge from faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Thyra system. He counted the ships as they appeared, one after another, filling his tactical display with red markers, until the screen looked like it was bleeding. And for the first time in his long career of conquest, he felt something cold settle in the pit of his stomach. But Kazrek was not a coward. He had not risen to the rank of Tyrant General by showing weakness, and he crushed that cold feeling beneath 30 years of battlefield confidence. He had 200 warships, 12 orbital defense platforms bristling with heavy weapons, and 300,000 ground troops dug into fortified positions across Thyra's surface. The humans had more ships, yes, but Kazrek knew that numbers alone did not win wars. He had fought outnumbered before, and won, because the Akari were born warriors, bred for combat, raised from hatching to believe that strength was the only law that mattered. He opened a communication channel to the Terran fleet. "Human Admiral," he said, letting his jagged teeth show in what passed for an Ikari smile. "You have come a long way to die. Thyra belongs to the Dominion now. Turn your ships around and go home, and I will allow your species to keep its place in the galaxy. This is my only offer." Admiral Voss's response came 30 seconds later, her face calm and her voice flat. "Thyra belongs to the Valari. You have 1 standard hour to begin withdrawal of all Ikari forces from the planet's surface and orbit. This is not a negotiation." Kazrek laughed. He actually laughed, because in his experience, species that issued ultimatums were species that were afraid to fight. The truly dangerous ones simply attacked. He let the hour pass without moving a single ship. At exactly 60 minutes and 0 seconds, the Terran fleet opened fire. What happened next would be studied in military academies across the galaxy for the next 1,000 years. It would be given the name The Reckoning of Thyra, and it would fundamentally change how every species in the known universe thought about humanity. The Akari expected a conventional naval engagement, 2 fleets facing each other and trading volleys of weapons fire until one side broke. That was how wars were fought. That was how wars had always been fought. It was ordered and predictable, and it favored the defender, which was exactly why Kazrek was confident. But humanity did not fight the way the galaxy expected. The first wave was not warships at all. It was the civilian asteroid tugs from the outer mining colonies, those rough and weathered crews who had volunteered with their heavy equipment. They had spent the approach calculating trajectories, and now they released their payloads, hundreds of captured asteroids, and chunks of space debris accelerated to tremendous speeds and aimed directly at the orbital defense platforms. The platforms were designed to shoot down missiles and torpedoes, small, fast targets with predictable flight paths. They were not designed to stop 1,000,000 tons of spinning rock traveling at a significant fraction of light speed. 8 of the 12 platforms were destroyed in the first 4 minutes. While the Akari reeled from the asteroid barrage, the Terran warships hit them from 3 directions simultaneously. Voss had split her fleet into 3 groups that had approached from different angles, using the system's asteroid belt as cover, and now they converged on the Akari formation like wolves surrounding prey. The Akari fleet fought back hard. They were experienced warriors, and their ships were powerful. And for a time the battle raged with terrible fury. Energy weapons painted the void in blinding colors, and ships on both sides erupted into fire and debris. But the humans fought differently than any enemy the Aikari had ever faced. They fought with a controlled fury that was almost frightening to witness. Their ship captains made decisions that no rational commander would make, pushing their vessels into close range where the fighting was most dangerous, because they knew that Aikari targeting systems were calibrated for long-range combat. Human marine teams launched boarding operations against Aikari carriers, cutting through airlocks with plasma torches and fighting hand-to-hand through corridors with a savagery that stunned the reptilian soldiers, who had always believed themselves to be the galaxy's most fearsome warriors. The Aikari were bigger and stronger, but the humans were relentless in a way that defied logic. They took wounds that should have stopped them, and kept fighting. They lost squadmates and turned their grief into fuel. Every human in that battle knew why they were there. Every single one of them had grown up with the story of the Dawn Cradle, and every single one of them had seen the broadcast of Matriarch Seluna being forced to her knees. This was not just a battle to them. This was personal. On the flagship Resolve, Admiral Voss directed the battle with surgical precision. She identified the weak points in the Aikari formation and exploited them mercilessly. When the Dominion's Wrath tried to retreat behind the remaining defense platforms, Voss ordered an EMP lance strike that overloaded the flagship's shields and left it drifting without power. In orbit, the battle lasted 9 hours. By the end of it, 147 Aikari warships had been destroyed or disabled. The remaining 53 had surrendered or fled. Humanity had lost 81 ships and thousands of lives, but they had won orbit. And now it was time for the ground. Commander Jonah Mercer led the first drop team, falling through Thyra's atmosphere in armored landing pods. While Aikari anti-air batteries tried to shoot them down, Mercer's pod was hit during descent, and he lost 2 of his squad members before they even touched the ground. He landed hard and came out fighting, rallying his remaining team and pushing toward the nearest labor camp. The ground war was ugly. The Aikari had dug in deep, and they made the humans pay for every meter. But Mercer and his fellow commanders had studied the layout of the camps from orbital scans, and they knew that speed mattered more than caution. Every hour that passed was another hour the Valari spent suffering. Mercer's team reached Camp 7 on the second day. They breached the outer wall with explosive charges and poured through the gap into a scene that made even hardened soldiers stop in their tracks. The Valari prisoners were in terrible condition, thin and broken and covered in the dust of the mines they had been forced to work in. Many of them could barely stand, and they looked up at the human soldiers with their large compound eyes, full of something that was equal parts disbelief and desperate hope. Terran military, Mercer announced through his suit's external speakers. You are safe now. The Aikari are being removed from your world. Medical teams are right behind us. A Velari elder stumbled forward, her wings cracked and her body trembling, and she asked in halting Terran standard the only question that mattered. The matriarch, is Seluna alive? Mercer looked at her and made a promise he was not authorized to make. We are going to find her. It took 3 more days of fighting through the capital city to reach the fortified compound where Kazrek had established his headquarters. The tyrant general had kept Seluna as a trophy, a symbol of Aikari dominance, and he had surrounded himself with his best troops for a last stand. Mercer's team fought through the compound, room by room, clearing every corridor, every chamber, until they reached a reinforced door at the center of the building. They breached it. Inside, the room was dark and cold, and in the corner, sitting on the bare floor with her thin legs folded beneath her, was Matriarch Seluna. She was ancient and frail. Her once iridescent wings were dull and torn. Her compound eyes were clouded with age and suffering, and around her wrists were the marks of chains that had only recently been removed by fleeing guards. She looked up as the human soldiers entered, and her antennae trembled. Mercer crossed the room and knelt in front of her. He removed his helmet, so she could see his face, so she could see that he was human, that it was a human who had come for her. "Matriarch Seluna," he said, "I am Commander Jonah Mercer of the Terran military. We received your distress signal." The old Valari stared at him for a long moment, and then she said in a whisper that cracked with emotion, "You." Mercer felt his eyes burn. He thought of his training and his duty, and the fact that soldiers were not supposed to cry. And then he decided that none of that mattered. Not here. Not in this moment. "We always were going to," he said. Outside, the last Akari resistance collapsed. Kazrak was captured alive, dragged from a bunker by human marines who handled him with considerably less gentleness than regulations required. Admiral Voss sent a single transmission to the Akari homeworld, and her words were broadcast across every frequency for the entire galaxy to hear. "Your forces violated a people under Terran protection. Send another fleet. Send 10. We will break every single one, and then we will come to you." The Akari Dominion formally surrendered all claims to Thyra within 1 week. The reckoning was over, but its echoes would shake the galaxy for a very long time. 6 months after the liberation of Thyra, the planet was almost unrecognizable. Where Akari labor camps had scarred the land, gardens now grew, planted by Violari farmers working alongside human agricultural teams who had traveled across the galaxy to help. Where guard towers had cast long shadows, medical clinics stood open and busy, staffed by both Violari healers and human doctors who had volunteered for 6-month rotations and then refused to leave when their time was up. Humanity had not just freed Thyra, they had poured themselves into rebuilding it. Terran engineers had arrived by the thousands, and they brought with them technology that the Violari had never been able to afford. Atmospheric processors that cleaned the dust from the mines out of the air. Water purification systems that turned the contaminated groundwater pure again. Communication arrays that connected the Violari to the galactic network for the first time in their history, with signals strong enough that they would never be ignored again. The Violari had protested at first, gently and politely in their way, saying that humanity had already done too much, that the liberation itself was more than they had ever dared to hope for. But the humans had smiled and kept working, and when Matriarch Seluna herself had told Admiral Voss that the debt from the Dawn Cradle was more than repaid, Voss had shaken her head. "Matriarch," she had said, "you saved 400,000 of our people when you had nothing. You gave us everything you had. Some of your healers gave their lives. There is no amount of rebuilding that repays that. This is not about debt anymore. This is about family, and family takes care of each other." Seluna had been quiet for a long time after that, and then she had reached out with her thin, delicate hand and placed it on the Admiral's arm. And the Violari empaths nearby had later said that the emotion flowing between the two of them in that moment was so strong it was almost visible. The most powerful moment of the reconstruction came on a day that would later be called the Day of Remembrance. A transport ship arrived at Thyra, carrying passengers that no one had expected. They were old, some of them very old, humans in their 60s and 70s, who moved slowly and leaned on canes and the arms of their children and grandchildren. And when they stepped off the ship onto Violari soil, many of them began to weep. They were the survivors of the Dawn Cradle. They had come from every corner of the Terran corridor, from Earth and New Horizon, and dozens of colonies in between. Some of them had been adults during the rescue, and remembered it clearly. Others had been children who carried only fragments of memory. The sound of Violari clicking songs, the feeling of being lifted by gentle hands, the warmth of a blanket that smelled like nothing they had ever known, but that somehow made them feel safe. By one, they met with the Violari who had saved them, or with the children and grandchildren of those who had not survived. An old man named Thomas Chen, who had been 19 years old on the Dawn Cradle, found the daughter of the healer who had treated his broken leg during the rescue. He held her hands and thanked her with tears streaming down his face. She touched his forehead with her antennae in the Violari gesture of deep affection, and told him that her mother had spoken of the brave young human with the broken leg until the day she died. A woman named Priya Sharma, who had been born on the Dawn Cradle 3 days before the reactor failure, met the family of Alice, the healer who had given her own food to a human infant and starved to death. Priya could not speak. She simply held a photograph of herself as a baby, the baby Alice had saved, and the Violari family gathered around her, and they all wept together, in a language that needed no words. Was broadcast across the galaxy, and it was watched by more beings than any event in recorded history. And something shifted. Not dramatically, not overnight, but slowly and surely, like a tide changing direction. The galaxy began to see humanity differently. For centuries, the galactic community had viewed humans as a minor species, clever and stubborn, but ultimately unremarkable. A civilization that was too young and too small to matter in the grand balance of power. They had been easy to ignore, easy to dismiss, easy to leave dying in the dark. But the liberation of Thyra had revealed something that no one had accounted for. That humanity's greatest strength was not their military, not their technology, not their numbers, it was their memory. They remembered everything, every kindness, every cruelty, every helping hand, and every turned back. They kept it all in a ledger that was written not on paper or in databases, but in the very soul of their civilization. And when the time came to balance that ledger, they did so with a thoroughness that left the galaxy speechless. The political consequences were enormous. The Akari Dominion, which had seemed so powerful and so invincible, began to crumble from within. The subject species that the Dominion had conquered over the past century watched what had happened to Thyra and realized that empires built on cruelty could be broken. Rebellion sparked on a dozen worlds. Former Akari colonies declared independence, and the Dominion's military, still reeling from the losses at Thyra, could not respond to all of them at once. Within a year, the Dominion had lost half its territory. Within 3 years, it would lose the rest, and Tyrant General Kazrek, once the most feared warlord in the sector, would spend the remainder of his life in a Terran prison, where he was treated humanely because humanity believed in justice, even for those who did not deserve mercy. Rithani hegemony quietly dissolved its trade agreements with the Akari, and sent a diplomatic mission to Earth, carrying gifts and expressions of friendship that were transparent in their motivation. They wanted to be on the right side of the ledger, and everyone knew it. The collective of Orth went further. They actually issued a formal apology for their failure to respond to the Dawn Cradle 60 years earlier. It was the first time in their history that they had apologized for anything, and their ambassador delivered it with the stiff discomfort of a species that was not accustomed to admitting it had been wrong. Ambassador Vasquez accepted the apology graciously, because humanity also believed in second chances. On the floor of the Galactic Council, a new phrase had entered the vocabulary of every species. Diplomats whispered it in corridors. Military commanders discussed it in strategy sessions. Traders and merchants factored it into their dealings. Terran Ledger. It meant something simple but profound. That humanity kept track. That they remembered who had helped them and who had hurt them. Who had stood with them and who had stood aside. And that their response to both was proportional and absolute. Kindness was repaid with kindness multiplied. Cruelty was repaid with a force that could shatter empires. Matriarch Seluna addressed the Galactic Council one final time, standing beside Ambassador Vasquez, her ancient body supported by a Terran-engineered mobility frame that let her stand tall. She spoke of the nature of kindness, how it was not weakness as so many species believed, but the most powerful force in the universe. because kindness created bonds that could not be broken by armies or empires or the cold calculations of self-interest. "I sent my people to save the humans because it was right," she said. "I did not know what would come of it. I did not expect anything in return. Anyway, something beautiful and terrible and wonderful. Because the humans took that small act of kindness, and they held it in their hearts for 60 years. And when we needed them, they moved the stars themselves to reach us." She turned to Vasquez. "This is what the galaxy should learn from humanity. Not to fear them, but to understand them. They are a species that believes, truly believes, that what you do for others matters. That compassion is not a transaction, but a sacred thing, and that those who practice it will never stand alone." The chamber was silent for a long time. In the weeks that followed, something remarkable happened. Species across the galaxy began reaching out to each other in ways they never had before. Small acts of cooperation and assistance that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. Not because they had suddenly become generous, but because the Terran ledger had taught them that kindness was an investment, and humanity had shown them what the returns looked like. In the final days of reconstruction on Thyra, Commander Mercer sat outside a newly built Vilari community hall and watched the sunset paint the sky in colors he had never seen on any human world. A young Vilari child approached him, curious and unafraid, and sat down beside him. "Are you one of the humans who came to help us?" the child asked. "I am," Mercer said. "Why did you come?" Mercer thought about it for a moment, and then he smiled. "Because a long time ago, your people helped mine, and we promised we would never forget." The child considered this with the seriousness that only children can manage. "Will you remember us forever?" "Forever," Mercer said, and he meant it. Far away, on a space station, orbiting a world that had only recently made first contact with the galactic community, a young alien diplomat was preparing for her first assignment. She was nervous and excited, and completely overwhelmed by the complexity of interstellar politics, and she had sought out an older colleague, a veteran of decades of diplomatic service, to ask for advice. "I have been assigned to the Terran delegation," she said. "What should I know about humans?" The elder diplomat paused, and a look crossed his face that was difficult to read, something between respect and caution, and perhaps a touch of fear. "Be kind to them," he said. "Be very, very kind, because humans never forget a kindness." He paused, "and they never forget a cruelty, and you do not want to be on the wrong side of their memory." The young diplomat nodded, and thanked him, and went on her way. And the old diplomat watched her go, and hoped she understood. Because the galaxy was learning, slowly but surely, what it meant to share the stars with a species that never forgot. Not a single favor, not a single slight,